Hi friends, welcome to Taming Python series. In this video, we're going to talk about how to integrate Swagger UI and model validations to Flask APIs using the Flask RESTx module. So if you use Flask RESTx, you can actually generate a user interface something like this automatically, which will give you an user interface to the API endpoints and you can test them actually. So in this video, we'll make an application something like this. So it's basically a simple to-do application. So we have created endpoints to manage to-dos. So let me just show you a quick demo of what we're going to achieve. So these are all the various endpoints, and here let's try to create a to-do. I'm going to click try it out, and let's try to do something like get veggies and execute. And let's try to create another task like cook food, execute. So now we have added two tasks, and you can see the response also 200. And now let's try to see what are the to-dos. So we have an endpoint called get to-dos, and let's try it out and execute that, and you can see the two to-dos we have created. Now let's try to edit this first to-do. So the ID is 1, right? So let's try to use a put request, and let's try to just try it out, and we are going to edit the ID 1, and let's try to do the task like get vegetables, and let's try to execute this, and it's a success. You got the modified task also in the response. All right, there is also model validation actually. So let's try to send a blank dictionary to this API endpoint, and let's try to execute. You can see bad request, task is required property. So even model validation is being done by Flask RESTx. All right, now let's see the modified to-dos. So I will get to-dos, execute, and get vegetables. You can even see a single to-do by just giving the ID in the URL. So try it out, get to-do ID. So the ID is 1, so let's try to execute that, and get vegetables. You got only one to-do in the response. And let's try to delete a to-do. Let's try to delete a to-do with ID 2. So let's try to go to the ID 2 and execute, and here you can see response, success response. And let's try to see the to-dos. Now we should have one to-do less, right? So let's try to execute the get to-dos, and you got only one to-do. So this way you get an awesome user interface to your API endpoints when you use Flask RESTx. And you also have a link to the API Swagger JSON. Let's try to click that, and you can see this is the description of all the API endpoints in OpenAPI specification. So if you give this JSON to some other tools, they can know what are all the endpoints and what are all the API models that are being exposed by your application. So this can help other APIs to integrate your API. So this is a very great advantage of using Swagger JSON in your apps. Alright, now that we've seen an awesome demo, let's try to do this. So to install Flask RESTx, you need to do a pip install. So let's try to do that. You just have to write python -m pip install Flask RESTx. So I'm going to open a command prompt, and I'm going to write python -m pip install Flask RESTx. Flask RESTx is installed. Alright, now let's talk about the terminology, because the API endpoints you create in Flask RESTx are not the same as Flask. There is some new terminology which you have to follow. So let's try to do that now. So if you see the user interface which I have just shown you, there are a lot of API endpoints, right? So you can group API endpoints into namespaces in Flask RESTx. So there is a thing called API application. So it contains a group of namespaces, and there is a thing called namespace, and it contains a group of endpoints. And inside namespace there are resources. So each resource is basically a root or an API endpoint, and each API endpoint obviously has get, put, post, delete, request methods. So each endpoint has multiple request handlers. So let's try to map this nomenclature to our existing application. So the whole application is an API application, and in that we have only one namespace, which is the to-dos API controller. So all the endpoints regarding the to-dos are grouped in this to-dos API controller. So this is a namespace, and in this namespace you can see there are two routes. One is to-dos route and one is to-dos/ID route. So these are two API endpoints, right? So a namespace has multiple API endpoints, and each API endpoint, obviously for any Flask route, you can have multiple request methods like get request, post request, put request, etc. So this to-dos endpoint here has two request methods, which is get and post, and this to-dos/ID endpoint has three request methods, which is get, delete, and put request methods. So this is a simple nomenclature of a Flask RESTx application. So it's the same thing, API application. It's basically an application created from a Flask application. And namespaces is a group of API endpoints. and an API endpoint is also called resource. It's like a Flask route, and then there is a concept called API model. API model is simply the payload definition. So in our example, for executing this API endpoint post slash to-dos, I need a to-do item to be created in the database. So the request payload I expect is I need an attribute called task and it should be a string. So I can define this API model using Flask RESTx API model. So there is a command called create to do command, and its definition is really simple. There is a attribute called task and it should be a string. And there is another command called update to do command, and it is used in this put request to do slash id. So it expects a model called update to do command, and the model should have an attribute called task and it should be a string. So this way, using API models, you can actually define the API payloads and you can even validate your API payload. Remember in our example, when we just passed a blank JSON object, it actually validated and gave an error that you need an attribute called task. So this way, API models are useful for validating your inputs to the API endpoints. And one more awesome advantage of using API models is you can actually marshal your response to JSON objects and actually eliminate the attributes which you don't want. So let me try to explain that to you. So there is an endpoint called getToDos. And here in the response, we expect a model called to-do DTO. So in this model, it says that each object in the to-do DTO list, which is obtained from the response, is having two attributes, which is ID, it's an integer, and task, which is a string. Suppose your Python response list has list of objects and each object has ID, task, and something like created it, updated it attributes also. But when you return those objects and you marshal to this API model, you only get two attributes in each object, which is ID and task, because you have defined the model like that. So this way, API models can also be used to marshal the response objects to JSON as per your model definition. And you've seen what a Swagger UI and a Swagger document is. This is a Swagger UI, and a Swagger document is the open API document generated using Flask RESTx. Alright, enough of demos and terminologies. Let's try to create an application that uses Flask RESTx. I'm going to take a blank folder and I'm going to open it with VS Code. Let's try to create a server. I'll just name it server.py. Since we are creating a Flask application, just try to import Flask and create a simple application in the beginning. So I'm going to write from Flask import Flask. Let's try to create a Flask application. App equal to Flask, and let's try to run the Flask application. Host equal to 0.0.0.0, port equal to 5000, and debug equal to true. And let's try to create a small endpoint to see whether our Flask application is working. So I'm going to write df hello, and it will return hello world, and we have to give a root app.route, and that's it. We have a simple Flask application. Let's try to see whether it works. So I'm going to run it. So you can see our Flask application is working. So if you don't know the basics of Flask, and if you want to know more concepts about Flask, I've already made a playlist on that, and I will leave the link of the playlist in the description. So go check it out if you don't know about Flask. Now let's get to the terminologies. The first thing is the outer box which we have to create, which is the API application, right? So let's try to create that now. So I'm going to write API equal to API class instance. So this class should be imported from Flask RESTx. So I'm going to import that now from Flask RESTx import API. So this is going to be a class of an API, and it's going to take an input of a Flask application. So first Flask application should be created and passed to this API class. And then I'm going to give some inputs here. So these are the general inputs required in most of the cases. So this is the title of your application. This is the description of your application. This is the version number of your application. So this is just for documentation and display purposes. And next thing here is doc. So doc equal to /swagger will actually mount the Swagger UI at this URL path. So if doc is not mentioned, then Swagger UI will be hosted at the root URL of the API application. And you can even disable Swagger UI if you want by mentioning doc equal to false. Then Swagger UI will not be enabled for the API application. And then I've given validate equal to true. This enables model validation in all the application endpoints. Alright, we have created an API application using the Flask application. The next thing is we have to create a namespace, right? So the namespace is simply a group of endpoints. It's like an MVC API controller. So I'm going to name it a to-dos controller. So it's going to be an instance of a class called namespace, and this should be imported from Flask RESTx. So I'm going to import this here, and the first input will be name of the namespace, which is to-dos, and the path of the namespace, which is to-dos, and the next argument is description. So path equal to to-dos means in this API application, this namespace will be mounted at /to-dos. So this way you can have multiple namespaces That means you have multiple groups of API endpoints at different paths inside the application. So it's just like an API controller in MVC application. Here you have created a namespace, but you have to attach it to the API application. So let's try to do that now. So I'm going to write API dot add namespace to-dos controller. So we have created a namespace and registered to the API. So now we have created an API application, we have created a namespace. Now let's try to create an API endpoint. So an API endpoint is basically a Python class which inherits from a class called resource. So you have to import this resource class from Flask RESTx, and let's try to create a class here, class to-dos, and this is going to inherit from resource, and each API endpoint has multiple methods. Let's try to get all the to-dos. So for that you need to go to the get endpoint, right? So I'm going to write get, and this is going to return the to-dos. So let's just return an empty array now, and obviously you have to give the route here. So write @ to-dos controller dot route slash. So inside this namespace at the slash route you have this API endpoint which inherits from a resource class. So we need to return the to-dos, right? Let's try to create a fictitious database. So I'm going to write to-dos db equal to a list of to-dos. So I'm going to return to-dos db. So you should get list of to-dos now. But to create a to-do, you can do a post request, right? So for that there is this method called post. So def post, and now using the post request payload, you can actually create a to-do and insert it into the database. So to get the post request payload, you have to write to-dos controller dot payload. If the task is in an attribute called task, this is the task which you want to enter. So I've just written a small logic which actually creates a to-do and appends it to the database. And then if you do the get request, you should get that inserted to do in the response. So that's it. We have also created an API endpoint using this resource class, and this API endpoint is at the route slash, and there are two methods which listen to the get request and post request. So get request returns the list of to-dos, and the post request will create a to-do based upon the post request payload. So that's it. We have created the resource and the resource endpoints with methods get and post. And one more thing we missed here is you have to use self here because it's an object method. And let's try to run the service. And let's go to the URL localhost 5000. You can see the existing route hello world at the root URL is still running. And now let's go to the API application. In order to see the Swagger document of the API application, you have to go to that /Swagger endpoint. So let's go to localhost 5000 /Swagger. And here you can see the Swagger UI for our API application. So you got the application, and this is one namespace which is to-dos, and here you have the two methods which you have created inside a route called to-dos. Alright, let's try to test our application. So first let's try to see what are all the to-dos inside the database. So try it out and execute. You got nothing. Let's try to create a to-do, try it out, and here you're not able to give any parameters because you did not describe an API model here. So let's try to describe an API model so that I can get a user interface here. So creating an API model is really simple. I'm going to write to-do controller dot model. First argument should be the name, create task command, and then you got to describe the model. So the JSON I will accept in the post request should contain an attribute called task, and it should be a string, and the attribute is required. So this fields should be imported from the Flask RESTx. So I'm going to write from Flask RESTx import field. So you got your model ready. So let's try to create a variable here, create to-do command. So this is my API model. It's that simple. So now this API endpoint expects this API model as a post request body. So I'm going to write to-do controller dot expect the API model, which is create to-do command. And that's it. Now the Swagger UI should show you the post request model. So let's try to save this and reload this. Let's try to reload the application. And you got a model registered with the application, which is a create task command. And let's try to create a task, and here you can see the API model being shown in Swagger UI. So let's try to try it out, and let's try to create a task to shopping, and let's try to execute. You got a success, and let's try to see all the to-dos now. Try it out, execute, and you got one to-do which has been saved in the database. And let's try to test out the validation. Instead of task, let's try to write something like ABCD, and let's try to execute it. You can see bad request because we have enabled model validation by default in the API application, and we did not write a single code to actually validate our post request body. We have just written a single line saying that we expect this model. So this way, just by writing a single line, you can actually define your post request body data structure. Now let's try to use the API model to actually control the response sent from the server. So here in this API endpoint called /to-dos, and if I execute this, I'm getting the whole task object because I'm actually returning all the task objects, right? But if I want to return only the objects with this attribute task, I'm actually marshalling the object to a JSON API model. So that can be done very easily. So first let's try to model a response object. So let's try to copy paste this, and it is a to do DTO, a data transfer object, and it's a model. Let's try to write it to do DTO, and it has a field called task. All right. While returning the to dos, I will marshal the response objects to this API model. So that can be done with a single line of code. I'll just write @ to do controller dot marshal list with this API model, which is to do DTO. So marshal list with to do DTO means you are expecting a list of objects with this API model. Let's try to reload this. So you got two models, which is a create DTO, which contains only the string, and let's try to create a to do now. Example to do, and execute this. Now I've inserted a to do. Let's try to get the to dos now. Try it out, execute, and here you got only the task, but ID did not come in the response because I'm marshalling the response objects into JSON objects with this API model. So this is how you can use API models and marshal your responses or validate your requests. So that's it. We have successfully created a functioning Flask RESTx application with API endpoints. Alright, let's try to complete the rest of the application. So here we created an endpoint to get all the to-dos, and to create a to-do, let's try to get a to-do by ID. So further the route would be /ID, right? So it will be another resource. So let's try to create another resource. So I'm going to write a Python class to-do, and it's going to inherit from resource, and the route of this resource or API endpoint will be @ to do controller dot route. It will be /ID, and it's going to be an integer, right? So you can give the data type also. All right, let's try to get a to do by ID. So I'm going to write def get, and it's an object method. So I'm going to write self and ID. This ID will be extracted from this URL segment because we have declared it here. So this is the logic which gets a to do. And here I can even send error codes. Here you can see if I don't find the to do with the requested ID, I can even send a 404 not found status. I just return to do's controller dot abort, and here I'm giving the error code 404 and the description of the error code. And obviously I want to send just the task and I don't want to send the ID, so I can marshal this response. So I'm going to write to do controller dot marshal with the to do DTO, and here I've written only marshal with because I'm just sending a single object. Here I was sending a list of objects, that's why I've written marshal list with, and here I'm sending a single object, that's why I'm mentioning marshal with. So let's try to save this, and let's try to see the API endpoints. You can see I got an extra API endpoints which gets the to dos by ID. So let's try to create a to do now. So I've created a to do, and let's try to get a to do by the created ID, which is 1. So I'm going to try it out, give the ID as 1, execute, and you got the to do. And let's try to create a endpoint which actually updates a to do. So generally you do a put request for that. So I'm going to define a method called put, and since it's an object method, we have to give self and then the ID, and it actually expects only the to do string, right? So you can just expect a to do DTO here. So I'm going to write to do controller dot expect the to do DTO, and here we're going to write a logic which updates a to do by its ID. So here we are finding a to do by its ID, and if we don't find a to do, we are actually sending a response code 404 not found, and if we find a to do, we are actually taking the payload from the request body and then modifying the database to do and then returning the to do in the response. We can even send the whole to do. So if I don't write any marshalling here, the whole to do will be sent, and if I marshal the response, only the to do DTO, which is the task, will be sent and ID will not be sent. So let's try to save this and reload the application. Here you can see we got another endpoint which is put. So let's try to create a to do and try to update it. I'm going to create a to do called ABCD, and let's try to execute this. You have created a to do. Let's try to see all the to dos, and I got a task ABCD. So let's try to edit the to do ID of ID1 as XYZ and execute this. In response, you updated the to do with ID and the task is changed to XYZ. So now let's try to see all the to dos. So get to dos, execute, and you can see the task is XYZ instead of ABCD. So that's it. You got API endpoints and Swagger UI, and you can even see the Swagger JSON here. Alright, that's how you can create an API application with Swagger and request validation and response modeling using Flask RESTx. So now let's try to see some useful tricks. Here, the whole application will be mounted at path to dos, right? But what if this whole API application wants to be mounted at a URL path, say API? So instead of mounting the API application to the main app itself, you can create a blueprint and mount this API application to the Flask blueprint. So let's try to do that now. From Flask, import blueprint, and let's try to create an API blueprint, and the name of the blueprint is going to be API, and the path would be /API. So you have to mention it using the attribute called url-prefix, and that's it. You got a Flask blueprint. And instead of attaching the API application to the main Flask application itself, let's try to attach it to the API blueprint. So I'm going to copy this and paste it here. Now our Flask RESTx API application is attached to the blueprint. That means the whole API application will be mounted at this URL called /API. And obviously, after creating the blueprint, you have to actually register this blueprint to the Flask application, otherwise API will not be visible. So let's try to register the blueprint. I'm going to write app.register blueprint API blueprint. And now our whole API application is mounted at this URL path called API. So let's try to save this and run this. And let's try to see localhost 50/100/swagger. You will see not found because the whole API application is shifted to /API actually. So if I write localhost 50/100/API/swagger, you can see the Swagger UI. So this way you can mount the whole Flask RESTx API application to a URL prefix using these Flask blueprints. Alright, let's try to look at another optimization which we can do here. Here you have created a single namespace called to-dos. Now you can expand your application to manage cats also. So there will be another namespace for cats. So the file will become more and more big. So the best practice I recommend is move all API namespaces in each individual files. So let's try to do that now. So I'm going to create a new folder called source and create a new folder inside that called namespaces or controllers. And here I'm going to create a new file called todos.py, and let's try to move this whole todos controller into that file. So todos controller definition and all the API endpoints. Let's try to cut that and paste in this todos.py. And here you got a todos controller. Let's try to do the imports from Flask RESTx. So I'm going to write from Flask RESTx import namespace, fields, and resource. So that's it. You got your independent controller in an independent Python file. And now you got to register that controller by adding a namespace to the API application. So let's try to import that here. I'm going to write from src.controllers.todos import todos controller, and I've registered the todos controller with the API application. Now if you want to add another namespace, suppose cats controller, you can add a new controller file here and register this here, and your server will look lean. And let's try to reload this. You can see everything is working fine without any errors. And now you can add multiple controllers with each file for a new controller and register this in the server, and the server code will not get bloated. So that's it guys. This is how you can use Flask RESTx to create Flask API endpoints with Swagger UI, model validation, response marshaling, etc. You can see I have created a blog post on using Flask RESTx. I have given the detailed explanation and example code so that you can copy paste and practice it in your own computer. I have also given you the references to the official documentation. Flask RESTx documentation is amazing. You have all the concepts neatly categorized. You have the quick start, you have full example, and you have topics like how to do response marshaling, how to do request parsing, etc. So I highly recommend you to check out the Flask RESTx official documentation to do further reading. Please ask questions or post your valuable feedback in the comment section. Hope you like this video guys. Thank you for watching. Peace.